It is a real pleasure to introduce tonight's guest, Dave Kilcullen, who is an expert, one of the foremost experts in the world on unconventional warfare, a former professional soldier from Australia and a diplomat. He spent 24 years as an infantry officer in the Australian Army, and followed by serving as a strategist in the U.S. Department of State, also under Condi Rice. We were in the same building, but working on adjacent regions.
I think you were working on much more important stuff than I was
I
at
don't
the
know
time.
about that. But he's currently the president and CEO of Cordillera Applications Group, and recently published a really great book, which I have just had a chance to read, called Blood Year: The Unraveling of Western Counterterrorism. And Dave, with that, do you want to just kick it off and tell us a little bit about that fateful year of 2014?
Yeah, for sure. What I thought I'd do is basically throw out some ideas, probably enough to just offend everybody, enough to start a conversation. And then I think the more important thing is the discussion we're going to have after this. But just to kind of frame it, we are now a little more than 16 years into what we called the war on terror after 9/11. And I think Americans and others are justified in asking ourselves, how has it gone? And what has taken place in that time frame? Has it actually made things better? Has it made things worse? How are we doing? And so the book is quite narrative in focus. But what I thought I'd do now is talk a little bit about these two constructs of war and terror, and try to give what I think is, if you like, a report card on where we're at. We've lost about 8,000 American service members or civilians killed since the 9/11 attacks. That includes the 3,000 murdered on 9/11. Been about 50,000 people wounded from the United States side in that time frame in a series of wars. Probably about 1 million civilians globally from all countries have been killed or injured by the war on terrorism. And so I think it's, in human terms alone, has been a hugely costly endeavor. I think we can ask ourselves, was it worth it? I have opinions on that, which I'll get to. The other point that I think we should talk about is the money. Every year there's an assessment produced by a US university on financial costs of the war on terrorism. The current bill, according to this university, stands at about $5.76 trillion since 9/11. The Defense Department differs with that. They say it's only been about $3 trillion. Only $3 trillion, but still a lot of money.
Dave, can I interrupt you for just 1 second? Is that worldwide or just by the U.S.?
Worldwide.
Worldwide.
Yeah. So we talk about a war on terrorism. Let's talk about war first. About 3 weeks after the 9/11 attacks, our first teams went into Afghanistan. By 7th of October, so just under a month after 9/11, we had our first Special Forces and CIA guys on the ground working with the Northern Alliance and later the Eastern Alliance to overthrow the Taliban in Afghanistan. It took us 7 weeks to defeat the Taliban. So by the middle of December, US with about 110 CIA and about 300 Special Operations guys had successfully defeated the Taliban the first time. We've since defeated these guys multiple times militarily. And so one point I would make is that we have proven ourselves capable repeatedly of defeating the enemy in the field in a military sense, but we have repeatedly failed to translate military effect on the battlefield into long-term political stability. Very shortly after the fall of the Taliban, we were confronted for the first time with a problem that we still haven't figured how to deal with, which is, what do you do when you're at war with a non-state actor who's hiding in a state with whom you're technically at peace? So we confronted the fact that a lot of senior leaders within Al-Qaeda had fled into Pakistan. At that time, an ally, but not yet a major non-NATO ally, as it was later designated. But since that time, in many other countries, we've dealt with this phenomenon of non-state actors hiding in societies or in terrain or in areas that we want to engage them, but we are not able to treat that area as a war zone. that was a very difficult problem to solve. Anya may disagree, but I think that the Bush administration fled conceptually from the difficulty of that problem into the superficially much easier problem of how do we deal with rogue states, and went to the threat of Iraq. And by March of 2003, we found ourselves in a war in Iraq. In many ways, the history of the war on terrorism since March 2003 has all been about digging ourselves out of a hole of our own making that we should never have been in, the invasion of Iraq. We still are yet to extricate ourselves from that. You can argue whether it was right or wrong to go into Iraq. One of the points that I'll make in general terms is that strategy is path dependent. So it's a very interesting academic question for historians about whether we would have been better off if we hadn't invaded Iraq. But as a practical matter, you know, we're dealing with those consequences, and we'll continue to deal with them for the foreseeable future. The Iraq War went extraordinarily badly until about 2006. It turned around in 2007. There was a period of relative calm, but I would not call that stability, between late 2007 and about the middle of 2010, and then it all began to crater again in 2011. Many people have put that down to President Obama pulling out precipitately, not leaving any presence behind in Iraq, and not being there with the leverage that was needed to prevent the Iraqi government from becoming super sectarian and driving people into the arms of this new Islamic State group that arose. I think that's a dramatic oversimplification. I also think it turns something into a partisan discussion, which isn't really partisan. Both parties in the United States made very significant strategic errors with respect to Iraq, the first one being invading it in the first place, the second one being pulling out without leaving significant presence to generate the kind of leverage that we would have needed to prevent the rise of ISIS. But I think the other huge factor in 2011 was the killing of Osama bin Laden in May in the Pakistani city of Abbottabad, which then threw Al-Qaeda into disarray. And Al-Qaeda spent about 6 weeks deciding who was going to succeed Osama bin Laden as the head of Al-Qaeda, and the number of factions emerged. Eventually, the current leader, Ayman al-Zawahiri, took over, but it took right until the end of 2011 for all those competing factions to settle down, and for the different, what we call franchises, the different regional groups within Al-Qaeda, to actually knuckle down and say, okay, we're going to support Zawahiri as the overall leader. What that meant was that Al-Qaeda was effectively missing in action for most of 2011, internally focused on their own succession struggle. And that turned out to be hugely important because 2011 was the year of the Arab Spring. And the Arab Spring gave the lie to the entire Al-Qaeda ideology, right? For 25 years, they've been telling people the problem is the apostate regimes, Tunisia, Yemen, Libya, Egypt, and many others. There's no way that these regimes can ever be overthrown because they're supported by the Americans. So what we have to do is attack the Americans, drive them out of the region. That will make the regimes collapse, and democracy and peace and religious freedom will ensue. And because we have to attack the Americans, and the Americans are so strong conventionally, we need to do that using terrorism, and so you need us. So Al-Qaeda's whole claim to fame for 25 years or so had been, you need us to get rid of the Americans in order to overthrow the regimes. And in about a 2-week period in 2011, peaceful, unarmed protesters demonstrated that that was actually bullshit. And it was actually quite feasible using peaceful democratic means for populations to rise up and throw off these oppressive regimes. And that was a giant crisis for Al-Qaeda, but they weren't positioned to deal with that because they were busy dealing with their own internal succession struggle. And by the time they resolved that and came back to the game, the Arab Spring had failed to deliver democracy. It had resulted, in fact, in chaos and the reimposition of oppression in a lot of places across the Middle East and North Africa. And people had begun to turn back to the armed struggle. But by that point, there was a new kid on the block, a much more dangerous and more aggressive and, frankly, less smart group of people in the form of Islamic State. And that is the problem that we've essentially been dealing with ever since. Today, we have conflict in Somalia, conflict in Kenya, the Sahel, southwestern Sahara Desert, across North Africa, into Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, down into Southeast Asia. I'm sure this, for a group of people in San Francisco, this won't be a surprise, but I was speaking to a Middle Eastern expert group in Washington a few weeks ago. And I said, and of course there's this fight that has just gone in Marawi, in the city of Marawi in the Philippines. And people said, oh yeah, we've heard about that. Some terrorists attacked a city. And I'm like, no.
They took over.
1,000 ISIS guys captured a city of 300,000 people in the Philippines and held it for 6 months. This is a really big deal, right? That something like this has never happened before in the Philippines or anywhere else in Southeast Asia. So we're dealing with a threat that is geographically, dramatically more widespread than it was at the time of 9/11, and significantly more capable, and we're dealing with a larger number of people. Donald Rumsfeld, who was the Secretary of Defense when I first came to work in the Pentagon, to be honest, I'm not a huge fan of Secretary Rumsfeld, but he did ask what I think was the most important question very early on in one of his snowflakes, these memos he used to write to people in the Pentagon, where he asked the question, are we killing or capturing more terrorists than our actions are creating in the war on terror? Are we actually making more than we're removing? 16 years in, I think the answer is that there are a lot more. They're much more widespread. They're much more capable. It's a little bit unclear as to whether that's all our fault, but I don't think we can afford to keep winning at the current rate, right? So that's the sort of first category of warfare. A lot of other stuff's happened in that time frame that we can talk about if you like, but that's the first bit. Now I want to switch to the terrorism part, and I'll move through that pretty quickly so we can get to Q&A. What we're dealing with in the terrorism side of the equation is a process of competitive co-evolution that's been going on really since before 9/11, but has really accelerated since the 9/11 attacks. As a military guy, I look at the 9/11 attacks and what I see is an expeditionary operation, right? You take 19 guys, you recruit them in country A, you train them in country B, you smuggle them into country C, you carry out your attack. It's an expeditionary operation. Already by 2004, we had closed down a lot of the borders and a lot of the air travel and visa loopholes that these guys were able to exploit in order to carry out the 9/11 attacks. And so they began to adapt. And what we first saw emerging by about 2004 with the Madrid bombing was what I call guerrilla terrorism, where instead of smuggling your team in from the outside, you grow the team close to the target inside the target country. So in the case of the Madrid train bombings in 2004, we had about 8 guys from Morocco who literally came from the same town where George Lucas filmed the Star Wars bar scene, if you can believe that, Tetuan in the northern edge of the Sahara. And they'd moved to Spain and were living in the same apartment block and began their own group primarily because they had tried to join Al-Qaeda and were rejected. So they decided, let's show these guys that we're actually capable. So it was the first real example. The biggest one was the London 7/7 bombings of 2005. And I think that's instructive as to how the guerrilla terrorism model evolved. So in the 9/11 case, Al-Qaeda smuggled 19 people in. In the London 7/7 case, they brought one man, Mohammed Siddiqui Khan from Pakistan, out openly under his own name, traveling under his own passport, commercial air, to Pakistan. He went into the tribal areas, received what I would consider relatively classic unconventional warfare training, and then went back in again openly on his own passport back into the UK, recruited a team, and then went and did the bombings. So getting around our lockdown of the external frontiers that happened after 9/11, these guys went to a guerrilla terrorism model.
And David, a team in 2005 of mostly UK nationals, is that right?
Yes, all UK nationals. And that's a key part, thanks Sonia, that's a key part of this model. The other key part of it that I think is relevant is they didn't plan the attack in London. And you see this in the Paris attacks most recently, where the Paris attacks weren't planned in Paris, they were planned in a series of other towns in Belgium and in France, where people have figured out, if I'm going to attack, let's say, San Francisco, and I put a team in San Francisco and I do my planning, I'm generating a signature that the local San Francisco cops will detect. But if I sit in Sacramento and I plan to attack San Francisco, it's a lot easier to do that. This is something that we started to see already by 2005. We also saw the rise of connectivity-enabled terrorism in many forms already by 2002, 2003. I'll give you one factoid which I think sums up the dramatic transformation since the year 2000 in the electronic connectivity environment. In the year 2000, there were a total of 30,000 cell phones for the entire country of Nigeria. By 2012, there were 113 million. So I'll save you doing the maths, but that's a 278,000% increase in about just over a decade. And we've seen similar dramatic growth in connectivity. Cell phones, the internet, satellite television, cable, dramatically expanding in the developing world. And that has enabled all kinds of activity that we didn't really expect to see, but it has driven a lot of what we've seen since. One of the key ideas in the way that terrorism's evolved since 9/11 has been an idea that actually comes out of the white supremacist movement in the United States in the 1980s, an idea called leaderless resistance, which is the idea that instead of having a secret group of guys who are planning something in someone's basement and moving money around and planning the attack and carrying out a plot, instead of doing that, what you have is a group of leaders who operate in the political space openly. They don't personally break the law, but they publish propaganda and agitation and techniques and procedures and how to carry out attacks, and they publish target lists, and they encourage people to just self-actualize and go do their own attacks, so-called lone wolf attacks. We've seen this become an incredibly important element in the terrorist repertoire, really since about 2005. And it's not simply a matter of lone wolves. It's people being remotely radicalized, operationalized, given techniques, given target lists, and then helped to go ahead and carry out those operations. Hugely important development in the terrorism environment since 9/11. Another big development is the emergence of low-tech attacks. So Al-Qaeda spent $500,000 doing the 9/11 attacks, most expensive terrorism event in history. Very sophisticated, very significant amount of planning, about 16 months planning. Probably the most sophisticated attack that I've personally been involved in was Lashkar-e-Taiba's attack from Pakistan on the city of Mumbai in India in November 2008, which involved 13 months of planning supported by elements of the Pakistani security services, and then involved a maritime insertion over several days, amphibious landing, 5 teams of 2 going out and carrying out a series of diversionary attacks and then launching a main attack. Very, very complicated. A lot of planning, a lot of money, a lot of effort, and admittedly a very significant effect. But as a side effect of this leaderless resistance, we still see that, but it's in fact not the main phenomenon that we see. Now we see, and I'll give you one example from Australia. 2014, 14-year-old boy goes to mosque in a suburb called Parramatta in Sydney, gets riled up, goes home, gets his uncle's gun, goes to a police station, starts shooting, and a civilian police employee was killed. We see many, many attacks like that now, which are essentially ad hoc attacks. Now, I was a counterterrorism intelligence guy for quite some time, and the way that traditionally we do this is we try to figure out who's in the network, what are they planning to attack, when is the attack happening. We try to penetrate it. We try to use human or signals intelligence or police methods to figure it out. None of that works when you're dealing with an environment like we're dealing with now, where the shooter himself doesn't even know he's going to do the attack until 2 hours beforehand. And so this ad hoc terrorism and low-tech terrorism has really changed the game significantly.
David, can you add a word about all the truck terrorism now?
Yeah,
mowing down people in Nice and in Barcelona.
Yeah, that's a great point. So this is actually not so new, right? About 74, 75 examples of this. Unfortunately, they keep on increasing in number since the 1990s. The first clearly jihadist example of this was in 2013, when a Nigerian and a Somali immigrant in London, who'd both been with Shabab in Somalia, ran down off-duty British soldier outside Woolwich Barracks in London, and then proceeded to cut his throat in public on a street corner in London. and then stood there and gave a press conference covered in blood while waiting for the police to arrive. So that was the first example. But as you mentioned, Nice, we've seen Berlin, New York recently, literally a couple of dozen other examples. This is an example of low tech, but it's also an example of soft targets. So 9/11 was a spectacular, right? It was an attack on a very large, prominent symbol of Western capitalism and Western democracy and Western military power. By now, we're seeing attacks that are directed at crowds, at public events, sporting events, concerts. We're also very importantly seeing the techniques become decoupled from the ideology, so that anybody now can pick up these techniques and use them. There was an attack on a casino in Manila over the summer where somebody used almost the identical attack technique to what Omar Mateen used to attack the Pulse nightclub in Florida. And this guy was not a terrorist, he was a disgruntled gambler. You may be aware of the attack in Las Vegas, I'm sure you are, which was by a guy with a series of weapons, but perhaps not as widely known. He was not only shooting into the crowd, he was shooting into a series of aviation fuel canisters that were on the other side of the concert venue on the edge of the airport, trying to blow those up to drive the crowd into a particular direction. And he had a car parked with explosives in it, ready to detonate. This guy was actually copying a technique used by Jemaah Islamiyah during the first Bali bombing in 2002, of using the first attack to shape the crowd in a particular direction and then doing most of the killing with a secondary bombing. So this guy, again, we don't know what his motivation was, but he was certainly not a jihadist. So these techniques are out there now, and I think, unfortunately, we're going to see them increasingly. Finally, just a very quick look forward. I talk to a lot of people who say, what are we going to do now that ISIS is over? And I say, what do you mean ISIS is over? ISIS is not over. ISIS was a state-like entity which did us the favour of coming out in the open with tanks and trying to control terrain. It no longer is that. It's dropped back to a network that's underground, that's in at least 27 countries, that has supporters in another 50 countries. There are 500 Syria-trained ISIS operatives at large in Western Europe, for example, according to Patrick Calva, the head of DGSI, which is the French equivalent of the FBI. To put that in perspective, that's the same number of people in the whole IRA in the 1990s, now at large in Western Europe. So it's not in no way over, but it's changed mode, and it's looking for new territory, and it's going in a different direction. But if you ask me what the threat is that we need to be focusing on now, I would say one is the geopolitical side effects of this war and terrorism that we've been dealing with. So the rise of an independent Kurdistan, which is totally transforming the relationship between Turkey, Russia, Iran, Iraq, Syria, and so on. The increasing Cold War between Saudi Arabia and Yemen across the Middle East. The essential Iranian takeover of Iraq, which means we're now dealing with a continuous band of Iranian-controlled territory all the way from Herat in western Afghanistan to the Golan Heights. So, and of course, the re-emergence of Russia as a major adversary power in the Middle East and elsewhere. So that's, I think, one of the key clusters of issues we need to be focusing on. The other is the most dangerous group that most people have never heard of, which is Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which is the Al-Qaeda ally in Syria, used to be called Jabhat al-Nusra, and it has all the military capability of ISIS. It has all the civil and governance and political savvy of Hezbollah. It has a significant amount of popular support in northwestern Syria. It has about 25,000 fighters, and it has a land border with NATO through Turkey. This is the group that we're going to be talking about in a year, even though we haven't talked about it very much to date. So it's not over. I really hope that I don't have to come back in 2032 and give you guys the 30-year rundown on the war. But the way we are going, as I said earlier, we can't afford to keep winning at the current rate because we're making the threat bigger and we're spreading it. And a lot of the, let's call them boomerang effects of what we've been doing overseas are now really starting to hit us in the homeland. So with that, I hope I've successfully riled enough people up that we can have a conversation. So Anya, do you want to start it off? Or?
Absolutely, I will. Thank you very much. That was a real tour de force of a very complicated subject. Let me start with what I'm sure many of our audience members are thinking, and that is, so now what? I mean, you threw out some really big numbers: $5 trillion spent, 8,000 Americans dead, 1 million impacted.
Right.
Was that all a waste? Should we be focusing, now that this has metastasized to such a degree, should we be focusing more on hardening the soft targets and defense? Should we be out there offensively fighting these groups? A combination of the two? What would you propose?
Yeah, look, I think we have one great advantage, which I didn't talk about, which is that we now don't have 300,000 US troops deployed in Iraq and Afghanistan, right? Which, if we were having this conversation 5 years ago, that was the case, right? Now we have about 13,000 US troops in Afghanistan, which is absolutely sustainable. We have maybe 5,000 in Iraq and Syria, which is also quite sustainable. So we've gotten away from having this giant forward presence, which is creating lots of casualties. And I think that's a really important advantage that we have now by comparison to a few years ago. I think that gives the opportunity for us to take a different approach, and it's to think about a sort of tripartite approach that involves very light footprint, special operations, advisors, not a lot of people on the ground. It involves heavy emphasis on training and working with partners to make it easier for them to deal with the threat in a sustainable fashion. And it involves the kinds of preventive activities that we've talked a lot about but haven't been very effective at since 9/11. And I think that the way that the strategy is currently framed in Washington is actually not bad, right? This is this idea of regionalizing the global threat, localizing the regional threat, and helping our local partners cope with that localized threat. That's pretty good as a concept. It's devil's in the detail in terms of execution. One other point to make is that as we think about terrorism going forward, as I said earlier, it's path dependent. So it would be nice if we could go back and redo things, but we can't. So we have to just deal with the environment that we're facing right now. And I'm actually I was quite favorably impressed by President Trump's speech on Afghanistan in his recognition of where we are at right now. I should say I don't take a side on domestic politics in the United States. I've only been a citizen for 4 years, so I have about as much knowledge of US politics as an American 4-year-old, so I tend to stay out of that. But you know, I heard President Trump's speech on Afghanistan, and he said really 3 things. We're willing to negotiate with the Taliban. It's no longer about force numbers. We're going for something that's small and sustainable. And we have to get the Afghans to do the bulk of the effort. And I remember thinking to myself, I wonder how Vice President Biden feels about President Trump stealing his plan, right? Because this was Vice President Biden's plan from 2009, right? It's very much the plan that everybody poo-pooed at the time as being insufficiently robust. It's basically the Biden plan with harsher language. So when you really look through the rhetoric of President Trump to what's actually happening on the ground, I do think we're working our way to a much more sustainable military posture. But now we have to think about these other pieces that have been missing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Thank you. Let me ask you a variation of that came from the audience, and that is, during the Obama administration, there was a lot of emphasis on countering violent extremism, CVE.
Mm-hmm.
Has it worked? Has it not worked? What would you do differently?
So CVE is a term that we've used to mean multiple different things, right? So preventing radicalization is one, countering people that are already radicalized and trying to sort of bring them out of networks, and then de-radicalizing people that have been arrested or whatever. And I think depending on what you mean by that, it has gone differently. I don't think it's gone well anywhere. I think part of the reason for that is this explosion of social media and the explosion of connectivity that's happened since 9/11, which has really created many more channels for radicalization than we saw in the past. Another reason is demographic shift. So when I first was working the JI target at the end of the 1990s, there were networks of hundreds to thousands of radicalized guys in Southeast Asia, mostly male, mostly late teens to mid-20s. By 2012, 2013, we saw a dramatically different demographic. Children as young as 12, the average age more like 15, not 20. Dramatically larger number of people, probably 12 times as many foreign fighters flying to ISIS as we ever saw at the peak of Al-Qaeda, mostly radicalized remotely or online. We saw many more women, about twice as many women as a proportion, so 6 times as many in absolute terms. It's worth asking ourselves why that is. And then just a much more savvy media and narrative effect on the part of the terrorists. So I talked about this as a co-evolution process. I think we're a lot better at CVE than we used to be, but the enemy's dramatically better at radicalization than they were.
And recruiting, yeah.
And recruiting, yeah.
So the follow-on from this, also from the audience, we're in the heart of Silicon Valley here. The tech companies have recently made a lot of news, mostly related to Russia. But if social media is one vector for radicalization, should we crack down on this more? I mean, I know you and I both know folks who used to be in the U.S. government who say Twitter, for example, was much too lenient on allowing radicalization on its platform and allowing, terrorist leaders to be on its platform. Do you think that's the case? Where do you draw the line between free speech and shutting it down?
I think that I'll give you the answer up front and then explain why I think this. I think that the answer is actually more freedom, not less, and it's more integration and accountability, not less. So for 2 reasons. One, yes, it's possible to shut down, well, maybe it's not possible. It's possible to try to shut down radical speech on social media platforms. I don't think that gets you very much. All it does is push it underground. It makes it a lot harder to track with the dark web and communication systems like Jot and like Telegram and Signal, WhatsApp, the tech platforms that are available to an adversary now are such that by pushing them off of Twitter, you're blinding yourself, but you're not really hurting them very much. So I think we get more from seeing what's out there than we lose by having that radicalization effect, personally. That may be my bent as a former intel guy. I always want to be able to see what's going on, but that's what I think. But then the other thing is I think that one of the big things that's driving, certainly in Europe, less so in the US, that's driving this kind of radical speech is members of communities, Muslim communities, who feel that they're second-class citizens, that they're losers within society, that they have not been integrated, that they've not been offered a fair shake, and that as a result they have this kind of permanent victim status, and they're given some kind of license to act out as a result. And I think that the response that we've adopted since 9/11, which is largely of treating these people with kid gloves and appointing our own pet or tame Muslim leaders to interact between the state and them, particularly again in Europe, not so much in the United States, has actually made the problem dramatically worse. So we've put these people, we've doubly alienated them within their own community and alienated their community from broader society, and it's actually generated a really significant backlash.
How would you change that? You would engage them more directly?
No, I would say basically you're an American citizen or you're a French citizen. You have all the rights and all the obligations of any other French citizen or any other British citizen or American citizen, and you know what? You can say whatever the hell you like, but you don't get to cut people's throats in the street. I guess also, as a soldier, my attitude to the guys I fought in Iraq and Afghanistan is, I'm gonna offer you the respect of taking your ideology seriously. I'm not going to pretend that it's not real or that you are making it up or that you're somehow psychologically damaged, but I do reserve the right to kill you, right? Because you're on the other side. And I think we do have to say to people, look, you can think and you can say whatever you want, but this is a nation of laws. We have rules, and you have to follow the rules the same as everybody else. And I think if you take a sort of radical rule of law approach that says no one gets treated better or worse than anybody else, and go back to sort of our roots as a society, I think that's a better way to do that than certainly what I've seen to some extent in Australia, but particularly in the UK, to a lesser extent in Canada, and to some extent in parts of Europe, where people are treated with this kind of, like it's a ticking time bomb. And the British, I think, are the classic example of this, where they appointed a Muslim council, right, to interact with the government. It's like taking a bunch of people who are immigrants from former colonial societies and putting them directly back in a colonialist setup where certain approved members of your brown community get to talk to our white officials, right? And I just think that that's a horrendous mistake.
Like the tribal councils in Afghanistan.
It's identical, right? And Michel Foucault, the French philosopher in the 70s, talked about boomerang effects. Things that empires do overseas eventually come to be impacted in the metropolitan state. This is exactly what we're seeing now. The Ferguson effect is an example of that. The militarization of police, the militarization of gangs, the way that a lot of techniques from the war on terror are now in the domestic space are all examples of that as well.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Let me walk through a lot of questions about the different countries that are either harboring terrorists, sponsors of terrorists. I'm going to move roughly west to east.
Okay.
So let's start with Saudi Arabia.
Mm-hmm.
Much in the news.
Mm-hmm.
Mohammed bin Salman, the new crown prince, soon to be the king, because there were some news reports today that King Salman is about to step down. This is a powder keg. I spend a little bit of time in the Middle East. I know you spend a lot of time in the Middle East. There's been a purge recently, supposedly anti-corruption, maybe a little bit more shoring himself up politically. And there's also a Shia minority in that Sunni kingdom. And by some reports, they are becoming more radicalized, partly through Iran, partly indigenously, we don't know. How do you see that situation?
Well, obviously Saudi Arabia is the heart of the Arabian Peninsula. And I think that your assessment's right, Anya. I mean, we've seen King Salman essentially set his son up to take over. This is actually a radical departure from the way that the Saudi kingdom has operated for 100 years, right? I mean, we have always loved to complain about the Saudis being too slow to make radical change, too slow to reform. We've been concerned about them being too tentative and a sort of gerontocracy where, everyone's turn, and you get these kings that are in their 80s. And now what we have is the dynamic, 40-something who's recruited a group of 30-something princes who are his guys. Many of the people that have been arrested or are currently being held in 5-star hotels for investigation.
On bare mattresses.
Are being accused of corruption. And of course, I'm sure that there are cases to be brought against many of these people that are legitimate. But if you're going to start charging people with corruption in Saudi Arabia, where do you stop? And I think the real important thing here is the move to a much more autocratic structure that's less consensus-based than what we've seen in the past. Ironically, the new king is likely to be much more of a reformer, much less conservative. As a student of revolutions, that causes an alarm bell to ring for me because it's liberalising autocracies that generally get overthrown by revolutions. But the other weird thing is that in the Middle East, we're seeing liberal autocracy. In Europe, we're seeing authoritarian democracy or illiberal democracy emerging in Hungary and Czech Republic and Austria and a number of other places. So it's an interesting kind of role reversal. As you know well, because I know you were there at the time, the kingdom had a really significant problem with Al-Qaeda between about 2001 and 2005. They've largely dealt with that through fairly oppressive security measures. But I suspect that these political shifts will probably give rise to a renewed element of that. And then, as you mentioned, Eastern Province, majority Shia. It also happens to be where the oil is. So that will be, I think, a potential flashpoint as part of this broader Iranian-Saudi Cold War that's going on across the Middle East. Saudi Arabia, I wouldn't call the forefront of that. The forefront of that right now is Yemen. The new one is going to be Lebanon. In weeks to months, we're going to see that kick off as the main confrontation area.
Say a little bit more about that, because those of us, the two of us who follow this a lot, most of the audience may not follow what's recently happened in Lebanon. That's quite critical.
So Rafik Hariri, the former prime minister of Lebanon, who was assassinated allegedly by Iranian-backed Syrian actors, his son is the current prime minister, resigned last week in Saudi Arabia. There are multiple different narratives. Some people in Lebanon are saying that he's essentially been arrested and is being held against his will in Saudi. Others have said that he's fled there for asylum purposes. Either way, it's a reflection of a really significant shift that's happened in Lebanon that really started as a result of the 2011 Arab Spring and the war in Syria that came out of that. And the shift was driven by a change in the role of Hezbollah. So Hezbollah has always portrayed itself as being primarily about Israel and about preserving Lebanon's interests and about caring about all Lebanese of whatever confessional group and focusing on the near enemy, if you like, of Israel. And in 2013, they basically demonstrated that that was not accurate by doing the bidding of their Iranian sponsor and simply sending troops into Syria to support the Alawite regime against Sunni and Shia Syrians who are rising up against the Assad government. And so that really cost them a lot of credibility in the Lebanese political space. And at the same time, we saw a significant spillover of violence from Syria into eastern and northern Lebanon, which is still very significant. And so Lebanon, the government of which is more or less, has been a pro-Western government and one of our allies, is now being increasingly eroded from the edges by different political groups who were relatively in balance until about 2013, but are now significantly out of balance. And that's making Lebanon a fruitful area of competition for Tehran versus a collection of Sunni Arab states, but particularly Saudi.
Right. Yeah. Very explosive situation right now.
And likely to go violent pretty quickly.
Right. And just south of there, Lebanon, you have Israel, which has successfully stayed out of the Syrian conflict. I was in the Golan Heights just about a year ago watching, what's the conflagration on the Syrian border. Do you think they're going to let themselves be drawn into a war with Hezbollah?
It's possible, but I think that one of the biggest realignments we've seen in the region in the last decade is the fact that the principal de facto ally now of the Israelis is actually Saudi Arabia.
I know.
Which I just...
Who would have thought?
Yeah. And, again, primarily because both of them see the primary threat as Iran. And in Israel's case, the relationship between Iran and its proxies, Hamas, Hezbollah, is the primary threat. And, of course, the Iranian nuclear program, which we haven't actually talked about as yet. But that's another big factor in the Iranian attitude. I would just put a little asterisk and say the Israelis haven't fully stayed out of Syria. They've mounted a number of attacks into Syria. And if you look at the pattern of Israeli attacks over the past few years, it's generally been either to prevent ISIS or one of the other really extreme actors getting a foothold close to Israeli territory, or to re-establish the balance that had been in place. So I think in a strategy sense, the Israelis are trying to play what the British used to call an offshore balancing role, right? They're trying to just keep things to the point where no one actor is strong enough to mount an attack on Israel. That makes a lot of sense. Whether it's sustainable in the context of a much broader Cold War between Iran and Saudi Arabia, that's a different question.
Great.
Yeah.
Okay, last one on the Middle East, and then we'll move beyond there. But we've had so many good audience questions on this. Iran. The president has just decertified the Iran deal, kicked it over to Congress. There's a lot of talk when I go to the Middle East and I talk to the Sunnis in particular. There's a lot of talk about the nefarious activities that Iran is conducting through Hezbollah and through others, stirring up trouble there. Should we keep the Iran deal? Should we not? Was it a positive thing? How can we fight against the other various problematic things that Iran is doing?
So I talk at length about the Iran deal in the book, but I should say I'm not a counter-proliferation or WMD guy. Certainly have no more knowledge about nuclear matters than any well-educated member of the World Affairs Council does. So I don't really discuss it in terms of counter-proliferation pact. But what I do talk about is its effect on the terrorism dynamic and the regional conflict dynamic in the region. I think it had a very negative effect, not really because of anything to do with the nuclear program per se, but because it created much greater freedom of movement for members of the Quds Force and IRGC, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard group, and a number of other actors within the Iranian system. It brought a lot more money to them. It allowed them to sell oil on the international community. That had an indirect negative effect because it created the dynamic of sustained low oil. Well, it was one factor that helped create the dynamic of sustained low oil prices that we've seen since 2015, because the Iranians were, for the first time, able to actually produce and sell oil on the open market and had no incentive to slow that down. And so that contributed to a real glut of oil in the market for a period. Generally, I think it was a negative effect. I am strongly against walking away from the deal at this point, for two reasons. One, it's not a bilateral deal. There are 6 countries involved. We can walk away from the deal, but it's still in effect. And all that means is we have less leverage and less visibility and less ability to affect what the Iranians do, but the deal still goes on, right? So it's not a bilateral deal that we can cancel by walking away from. And then the second reason for not moving away from it is this issue of decertification. Decertification is a purely US internal thing. The Congress was unhappy with the way that President Obama did an end run around them to get the deal negotiated. And so sort of in retaliation, they passed this deal which says that the president's got to certify that Iran is in compliance. And then if he doesn't certify that sanctions can snap back. So all the president has done here is decertified Iran's compliance for 1 3-month period. In common with the general Trump hysteria, many people have thought that was the end of the world. But all it is it's a report to Congress on compliance of a multilateral treaty. So, I think that the deal isn't dead, nor should we want it to be at this point.
And passing the buck to Congress, and Congress doesn't want that particular buck.
Speaking of bucks being passed to Congress, the other big thing, of course, is the AUMF, right? The authorization for the use of military force, passed after less than a day's debate, 7 days after the 9/11 attacks, and still extant. And it's less than 300 words long. And it passed after virtually...
Give a little background on that for those
who
don't know.
The Constitution, as everybody knows, gives Congress the power to declare war. And so the president is not supposed to engage in long-term, sustained, large-scale combat operations without, at the very least, getting approval from Congress. 2 days after 9/11, I forget the bill number, but the House of Reps and Senate introduced a joint bill that was essentially the authorization for the use of military force that gave congressional and constitutional approval to what has become the war on terror. As I said, it's about 247 words long. It talks about attacking those people responsible for 9/11, names Al-Qaeda, talks about attacking other people that supported them. Doesn't mention Iraq, doesn't mention Pakistan, doesn't mention ISIS, which didn't exist at the time. And that has become the basis for the assertion, essentially, that we can wage unlimited war forever anywhere in the world against whoever we choose. And suddenly this has become a cause célèbre in the last 9 months because people don't like the guy who happens to be in the White House. But it was just as bad of a problem under President Obama as well, where we saw a dramatic increase in the number of drone strikes going into countries that we're not at war with. And we saw the adoption of a series of norms, which I think we're going to really regret in the future, and I'll just use drones as an example, but we did a similar thing with special operations, where we essentially asserted the right to strike any target anywhere in the world at any time using a drone, as long as it meets our own ethical standards and our own internal legal review. So what do we do when the Iranians put a drone on somebody in Libya And they say, no, it's okay because we went through our own ethical review in the Guardianship Council and it met the standards of the Sharia law that we apply. Well, what do we do when the Chinese strike a Falun Gong activist in San Francisco? Right. And they say, no, the Ministry of State Security reviewed this and it's cool, right? So we've created a series of norms which I think we're going to look back on with some regret as things go forward.
I agree with that. Let me add, just because I had multiple questions on that, Iran's role in creating and arming Hezbollah. How important is it? Is it ongoing? How much of a threat is it to the region?
Hezbollah's source of strength, I think, comes from multiple sources. One of them certainly is Iran. Money, advice, regional political support, top cover for things that have happened in the past. I don't think it's accurate to think of Hezbollah as a wholly owned subsidiary of the Iranians. They do actually have in the past had significant local popular support, which has largely been driven by them putting a lot of effort into a broad spectrum of measures, coercive, administrative, and persuasive, to try to win over the population. I don't talk about it in this book, but I have a whole chapter about it in the previous book, which is called Out of the Mountains, where I have a case study and I look at an organization called Jihad al-Bana, which is the Hezbollah reconstruction organization. So when we were both in the State Department, there was a war between Israel and Hezbollah, which ended in an Israeli military defeat of Hezbollah. But by the end of that year, Hezbollah had bounced back to be dramatically stronger than it was at the end of the war, primarily by leveraging reconstruction, trade unions, education, clinics. And if you look at the spectrum of Hezbollah activity, they've got everything from a television station, multiple newspapers, people in the cabinet, a political party in parliament at one end of the spectrum, through this administrative and governance system in the middle, down to some pretty effective coercive military and terrorist activity at the other end. So they're basically mimicking a state. It's a state-like entity. And that's given them huge amount of resilience over time. But as I said, I do think they've lost a lot of credibility by demonstrating themselves to be the lapdog of Tehran in what they did in Syria. And I think they've got a bit of ground to make up.
Very interesting. Good. Moving east. You talked a little bit about Afghanistan, and you have a lot about Afghanistan in the book. It's a very difficult situation. We went from post 9/11, light footprint, to having over 100,000 troops there, but Obama famously saying we're going to start pulling them out, to a very low troop number, to now the level where we're increasing it slightly and we're moving to, as you said, to more of a counterterrorism strategy.
Yeah.
Poor President Ashraf Ghani is sitting on top of a very difficult situation.
Right.
What's your prognosis for that country? In two things. One, will it be a haven for terrorism again? One. And two, what's the chance that the country can sustain itself, even if it's not Switzerland, just to be Bangladesh?
Yeah. Well, there was a period there where the CIA issued a national intelligence estimate, which is public, you can read it, where they said that they estimated there were 50 to 100 al-Qaeda guys in Afghanistan. This was the beginning of 2013.
Right. Not a lot.
I had teams on the ground in Afghanistan at the time. I think that was an underestimate by a factor of 10. I think there were at least 1,000 to 1,500 at that time. Since we left at the end of 2014, al-Qaeda have come back in to an area known as Nuristan and another area called Kunar in northeastern Afghanistan, and have really reoccupied an area. In fact, we did them a favor. We went in and cleaned out the Taliban and a bunch of other groups that had been competing against them, created a vacuum, and then left, and they came straight back in. So there is a significant al-Qaeda presence in Afghanistan again. Will it again become a base for an attack on the West? I don't think so, not because of anything good that we've done, but because they don't need it anymore. They've got 500 operatives in Western Europe, so they don't need it. So I think the chances of al-Qaeda using Afghanistan again as a base are relatively low.
Or another terrorist group.
Or another terrorist group. Again, relatively low. ISIS in Afghanistan is actually a Pakistani group. Comes from a splinter group of the Tehrik-i-Taliban Pakistan, the Pakistani Taliban, that split off in 2015, and is really very heavily focused on regional issues. The Taliban, one of my jobs when I worked for General McChrystal in Afghanistan was to talk to the Taliban fairly regularly. They are easy to talk to. They're not making a secret of what their objectives are. Their objectives have stayed the same for the last 10 years or so, and it's foreign troops out, Pashtun areas of Afghanistan to be run by Pashtuns, by which they mean them. Some positions in the cabinet, their position is, in return for that, we promise not to be a threat to any other country and not to support Al-Qaeda. And they've had a relatively consistent position for about the last decade. And I was rather heartened by President Trump essentially hinting that we'd be willing to talk about a deal.
But very key, no acceptance of the Afghan constitution.
Correct. But again, we're talking about the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan fighting the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan. And both of them regard Sharia as the basis for law in the society. And there was a study done by the law faculty of Sydney University 5 years ago, which compared judgments in Afghan government courts against judgments in Taliban courts on an index of how radical they were in religious terms, and found that they're more or less the same. In fact, the state courts were slightly more radical at that time. So could we live with the Taliban being part of the long-term governance structure of Afghanistan? So hate to break it to you, but they already are, right? It would simply be a matter of formally recognizing what is already the case. But I don't think that that's the actual problem. I think the problem is putting our presence in Afghanistan on a sustainable footing and making it something that can really help to have a stabilizing effect long term. So two issues there. One is military, the other is civilian. Right. On the military side, we only have 13,000 troops there. That is absolutely sustainable. People often say to me, it's impossible for us to keep troops in Afghanistan. There's no way that we can do that. It's just ridiculous to even think about it. There's a one-word answer that contradicts that, and that's Korea, right? We've got 28,500 troops in Korea. Right. We've had between 28,000 and 200,000 in Korea ever since 1945. It hasn't broken the bank. It hasn't generated unsustainable effort. Asking when does the operation in Afghanistan end is like asking when do we get to pull out of Europe, right? So,
and more recently, we did it in Bosnia.
Right. We still have, people don't realize we still have people in Bosnia, right? So the issue is the casualties. The issue is losing people. So it's getting the kill rate down to the level where it's low enough that it doesn't become unsustainable. I think a lot of that is about shoring up the Afghan civil governance system. The Afghan national security forces are actually pretty decent. They win most of their fights against the Taliban. They're holding their own. They're losing too many people, but that's largely a technical matter to do with air support and intelligence, which are both elements that we're trying to fix right now. The big weakness is civilian, local level governance that's reactive to the needs of the population.
And we've ratcheted down, of course, our aid in Afghanistan as we ratcheted down our military presence. Yeah. When I think you and I would probably say you should have actually pushed it up.
Yeah, well, this is an instance of a broader pattern, which is that we have repeatedly asked the military to do things that are not military jobs, and we've repeatedly critiqued the military for failing to do those jobs, and we've repeatedly failed to translate military success on the battlefield into long-term political outcomes that we're looking for. I think it's become a caricature discussion about whether the military knows how to defeat terrorism or how to do counterinsurgency. The military knows how to do that. It's been successfully doing it since 9/11. The issue is the nation doesn't know how to translate military effect into long-term political outcome. And that's not a military problem. A guy called Dan Bolger, who I have huge respect for, we served in Iraq together. I was there in Baghdad the day that he was wounded, wrote a really good book called Why We Failed. And I love Dan, but I actually disagree with the overall outcome because his examples that he puts forward in the book are all civilian examples, right? They're not actually military issues. They're issues like we failed to put in place effective civilian governance at the local level. We failed to deal with corruption. We failed to reconstruct the state-owned enterprises in a way that gave people jobs. Why did we ever think that was the job of infantry brigade commanders? We have failed to put the civilian effort in that was and to resource it. It's not the fault of the civilian agencies to actually do what's needed here.
Right. Good. And now the big one, multiple questions on, of course, Pakistan, ranging from how can you get them to stop supporting Taliban elements, to how sustainable is that government. There have recently been corruption allegations against the prime minister. What is the likelihood that there's going to be another military coup?
So let me do the last one first. I think the likelihood of a new military coup is relatively low. Yeah, I think that there was a sequence really beginning in 1958. And Anya, feel free to jump in here because I know you're the real Pakistan expert. But there was a cycle of coups and counter coups that really began in 1958. That it wasn't until about 2012 that we started to see the emergence of a fully civilian government that wasn't what political scientists call a Praetorian system, where the military is kind of standing there ready to take over at any moment and overshadowing political discourse. And I think we do have now a genuinely civilian system in Pakistan, albeit one where the military plays a really significant role that's outside the direct control of civilian elected politicians.
Mm-hmm. I like to tell one vignette on this front,
sure.
Because Pakistan really has moved towards having a real civil society. I was there in 2013 during the elections that were the first to transfer one civilian government to another. And we kind of snuck away from our handlers and went around Lahore in a rickshaw. And many Pakistanis are illiterate, so the voting slate is animals and symbols. And the rickshaw driver says to us, "Madam, I am running for city council. Look, right here, my symbol is the goat." You know, when the rickshaw driver is running for elected office, that civil society has taken hold. That doesn't mean that it'll last forever, but there really is it's just to illustrate what you're saying, it actually is a different Pakistan than the one you had in the 80s, 90s.
Yeah, and even in the early 2000s under Musharraf, that's for sure. I also think that but I do think that Pakistan is in a strategic, let's call it a strategic system, that tends to make it difficult for us to achieve sustained cooperation with them on the issue of terrorism. It's a gentle way of putting it. I often hear Pakistani military colleagues say, well, we've lost thousands of people to the Taliban. We're fighting the Taliban. We've been one of the frontline states. That is true if you're talking about the Pakistani Taliban. If you're talking about the Afghan Taliban, certain elements within the Pakistani military establishment have persisted in regarding the Afghan Taliban as an insurance policy, right? A way of preventing India from getting into the hinterland and strategically encircling Pakistan and creating a control over an area that would be deeply dangerous to Pakistan and its continued standoff with India. They're not wrong to be paranoid about that. That's what India's doing, right? That's actually true, right? But it doesn't give them an interest in cooperating with us on dealing with the Afghan Taliban. And then I'm sorry to say that I think that Al-Qaeda has over time become a bit of a cash cow for Pakistan, whereby the presence of Al-Qaeda in Pakistan means that they get literally billions of dollars in aid, and they get treated as an equal to India, which is 10 times the size. They get listened to, they get a lot of attention, they get treated with kid gloves in the same way that I spoke about earlier. And it's very difficult to ask any establishment, any bureaucratic establishment, to move away from something that's so useful to them. I was, in fact, not surprised by the discovery of Osama bin Laden hiding essentially on the outskirts of the Pakistani military academy in Abbottabad. I was surprised by how surprised a lot of people in the Pakistani military were by that. And I think that suggests that it isn't the case that Pakistan is the enemy, and it's not the case that the Pakistani military is on the other side, which is something you often hear from people that work in Afghanistan. It's that there are elements in the structure that have their own interests and have done since the 80s and are pursuing those more or less independently of what political leaders or the bulk of the population in Pakistan wants.
Thank you. That was a tour de force. We are unfortunately out of time. And I want to leave you, you need to take it up after because we really are out of time, but I want to leave you with one really nice question that I wanted to end on. And after we have had this really sobering discussion about counterterrorism in the Middle East and Asia, Somebody asks, what can I do to pursue a career in counterterrorism and international security? And I want to leave it there.
Come and see us after all.
Exactly. Please join me in thanking Dave Kilcullen for this fantastic discussion, and thank you, all of you, for your terrific questions. His book is really great, Blood Year. I am about a third of the way through. I'm going to finish it this weekend, and it's for sale outside if anybody wants him to sign it. So thank you very much.
All right, thank you. Thanks, Anya.